The Blackwood Manor sat at the edge of the Maryland woods, like a painting of serenity. Its whitewashed walls gleaming in the sun, its windows catching the light in a way that made the house seem alive, breathing with a gentle rhythm. From the outside, it was everything a family home should be. The front garden carefully pruned, flowers arranged in precise symmetry, birds singing in the early morning mist, and the faint scent of baked bread drifting from the kitchen chimneys. Neighbors who passed the house on their morning walks waved and received warm smiles in return. The children who played in the yard appeared joyful, their laughter ringing out and mingling with the rustling leaves. To anyone observing, the Blackwoods were ordinary, perhaps even admirable, a family whose manners were impeccable and whose generosity was noted in local journals. Yet beneath this surface of care and civility, the house carried a different energy, subtle and insidious, something that seemed almost to whisper in corners and shadowed hallways. It was a quiet hum of expectation, a pulse beneath the walls that no one dared acknowledge, but that could be felt in the chest if one paused too long at the edge of the garden or glanced at the manor's windows in the dying light. Inside, the air was perfumed with faint hints of lavender and cedar polish, a comforting mask to cover the meticulous work done in preparation for things that outsiders could never imagine. Every item was positioned with care, the chairs aligned exactly 3 inches apart, the rugs flattened and smoothed, the books on the shelves sorted not by subject, but by the way their spines reflected the sunlight, as though the light itself were a tool in some hidden ritual. The walls, painted in soft creams and warm earth tones, were also marked with almost imperceptible lines, minute etchings and scratches that would go unnoticed to the casual eye, but which guided steps, gestures and positions for those who knew to read them. It was a home where even the air seemed to obey rules, where every shadow had its place and every sound could be measured and catalogued. Mr. Blackwood, the patriarch, moved through the house with a calm that was both reassuring and unnerving. His eyes, dark and calculating, would linger on objects as if testing their alignment, or on his children as if reading their souls. He greeted visitors with a smile that seemed genuine, yet it never reached the corners of his eyes, leaving a faint coldness lingering in his gaze. Mrs. Blackwood, equally composed, carried an aura of maternal warmth that drew people in, encouraging trust. Yet there was something rehearsed about her gestures, a precision in the way she placed her hand on a shoulder or adjusted a ribbon in a child's hair, as though every movement were part of an intricate choreography designed to maintain appearances. The twins, only months old, lay in their cribs, their skin soft and unblemished, their tiny hands curling in rhythm with their breathing. To anyone looking, they were safe, protected, loved. But even in the nursery, the lines and marks on the walls framed every angle of their cribs, dictating the positions in which they would sleep, the way their limbs could move, the orientation of their gaze. The house itself seemed to cradle them, yet also confine them, turning a room of innocence into a space carefully mapped to observe and influence every twitch, every murmur. In the hallways, the servants moved like ghosts, silent and precise, their footsteps measured to avoid disrupting the invisible patterns that the Blackwoods had established. They swept, dusted and polished with a ritualistic rhythm, unaware that their labor was itself part of the larger design, a stage set to hide the true nature of the household. Even the meals were orchestrated, not just in their taste or presentation, but in the order of consumption, the angle at which the food was placed, the way light fell upon the plates as if to train the senses without drawing notice. Outside, the woods pressed close to the house, dark and unyielding, a silent witness to the lives unfolding within. The wind through the trees carried no warning, only an almost imperceptible sense of observation, as though the forest itself were complicit in the quiet horrors yet to unfold. Every creaking floorboard, every distant howl of a dog, every sway of the tree branches was catalogued by the eyes behind the smiles. The Blackwoods understood that evil, in its most terrifying form, does not announce itself. It hides beneath the ordinary, cloaked in kindness, wrapped in the familiarity of a home, and taught in small lessons that no one questions. A visitor stepping through the front door would see nothing but grace and warmth. They would comment on the beauty of the wallpaper, the charm of the furniture, the serenity of the twins. They would never notice the etched lines that guided movement, the mirrors angled to capture more than reflection, the subtle adjustments in every object made to condition those who dwelled there. Yet the house itself seemed alive with intent, a silent accomplice to the methodical mind that controlled it. And as the sun set behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns, the Blackwoods moved through their home, smiling, calm, ordinary. But beneath their composed exterior, the machinery of darkness hummed steadily, patiently, preparing for the next steps, for the unseen rituals, for the day when the world's perception of innocence would collide with the carefully hidden reality of cruelty. The House of Smiles was perfect. It was ordinary. And it was waiting. The twins arrived quietly, as though the house itself had held its breath for their first cries. Their skin was pale and flawless, their tiny fingers curling instinctively around any touch that approached, their eyes wide and unknowing, reflecting the soft lamplight of the nursery. To visitors they were perfect, innocent embodiments of fragile life and hope, and the Blackwoods' expressions as they gazed upon them could have been mistaken for the purest form of love. Mr. Blackwood bent over the cribs with a careful reverence, adjusting a blanket with hands that seemed tender, while Mrs. Blackwood lingered at the doorway, eyes glistening with what outsiders would call devotion, yet there was a precision in their movements that betrayed a different intent, a rigidity that suggested the twins were not only cared for, but also observed, catalogued and conditioned from the very moment of birth. The nursery was a reflection of the rest of the house, soft colors, gentle rugs, toys arranged neatly, but every item was positioned deliberately, every angle calculated to monitor movement and behavior. Mobiles above the cribs were constructed with exacting geometry, their shadows forming subtle patterns on the walls, patterns the parents watched as carefully as the children themselves. Gentle songs were sung at specific intervals, but each lullaby carried slight variations in tone and timing, adjustments meant to elicit subtle reactions, a furrowed brow, a twitch, a tightening of the tiny hand. The twins' days were regimented, divided into carefully measured periods of feeding, sleeping, and observation. There was little room for spontaneous movement or unstructured play. The room's rhythm was dictated by the Blackwoods' meticulous schedules. When one cried, it was not immediately soothed. Instead, the parents watched, noting the intensity and duration of fear, the way it manifested in small tremors or widened eyes. It was an education in terror disguised as parenting. Nights, however, brought the most unsettling rituals. The twins were placed side by side in their cribs, swaddled identically, and the Blackwoods would perform silent observances, sometimes for hours, tracking breathing patterns, recording sounds, or tracing invisible lines on the nursery floor that the children were never meant to cross. Candles were lit in specific sequences, shadows stretched across walls to obscure or reveal corners of the room. Occasionally, small objects, soft bells, delicate brushes, tiny glass beads were introduced, not for play but as stimuli to provoke subtle reactions, responses that were then measured and memorized. Even their exposure to touch was controlled. Hands approached only from certain angles, fingers placed lightly on specific joints, the smallest gestures catalogued and repeated like laboratory experiments. The twins were adored, but the affection had the precision of a ritual. Every caress, every whisper of encouragement, every kiss placed on a forehead was calculated to teach compliance, to foster trust, while simultaneously instructing obedience. Isolation became part of their education. The twins were rarely allowed to interact with the wider household. Servants appeared only briefly, their presence curt and measured, and they never lingered in the nursery beyond the allotted tasks of feeding or cleaning. Guests were almost always denied entry, and if they glimpsed the children, they would only see smiles and coos, unaware of the subtle unease that had been cultivated in the tiny minds. Even light and sound were manipulated. Curtains were drawn in precise configurations, allowing rays of sunlight to fall on certain areas of the cribs while leaving others in shadow. Nighttime sounds, from the creak of floorboards to the soft rustle of trees outside, were accentuated or muted, conditioning the twins to notice every change, to react with attention and sensitivity. What outsiders might call natural curiosity was guided, shaped, and restrained. There was no room for rebellion, for randomness, for unobserved thought. The Blackwoods observed, recorded, and repeated a methodical cycle of control masquerading as devotion. Their affection, while seemingly pure, contained layers of instruction. A smile at the right moment taught obedience. A gentle touch introduced a pattern of fear and reassurance. The twins learned, without understanding, that every action had consequence, that every reaction was monitored. It was a slow, almost imperceptible erosion of innocence, a conditioning so subtle that it could be mistaken for ordinary parenting. Yet beneath the surface, a ritualistic intent guided every moment. Occasionally the parents would perform small ceremonies at night, subtle and quiet, their significance invisible to anyone not initiated. Objects were aligned, marks traced on the nursery walls with fingers dipped in water, patterns repeated and reinforced until the children began to respond to them instinctively. The twins' awareness expanded, but only within the boundaries the Blackwoods permitted. Their understanding of the world filtered through layers of control and observation. The house itself became part of the instruction, a silent, omnipresent figure in their upbringing. The walls bore witness to every sound, every movement, cataloguing reactions and imprinting lessons without words. Even the furniture seemed alive with intent, each crib rail, each dresser corner, each carpet edge a part of a larger geometry of influence. And as the days passed, the twins' innocence remained intact to the casual eye, their faces cherubic, their expressions soft and trusting. Yet beneath the surface, subtle cracks formed. Curiosity was guided, fear was measured, obedience was ingrained. The ritual of daily life, hidden beneath warmth and care, was slowly shaping them, preparing them for the intentions their parents had long planned, but never spoke of aloud. Outside the nursery, the house continued its quiet hum of life. Servants moved with measured grace, the garden remained meticulously tended, and visitors were met with smiles and tea. But the air carried a tension that was invisible yet palpable, a dread that lingered just at the edge of perception. It was the shadow of something methodical and patient, a darkness that did not announce itself, but grew steadily, shaping the twins' world before they could even name the emotions they felt. And in the soft glow of lamplight, the Blackwoods watched, calm, devoted, saintly in appearance, but utterly consumed with the precise cultivation of innocence poised on the brink of corruption. The mind of Mr. Blackwood was a labyrinth of calculation, precision and obsession, a place where charm and intellect hid an almost surgical cruelty. To the townspeople, he was the picture of refinement, polite, learned, quick with a smile that seemed to warm the soul, a man whose presence invited trust rather than suspicion. His hands were steady, his voice even, and his eyes, though dark, reflected intelligence rather than malice. But beneath that veneer of civility, a meticulous mind catalogued every detail of the people around him, dissecting emotions as though they were specimens in a laboratory. The slightest flicker of fear, the tiniest hesitation, a micro-expression of distress, all were noted, classified, and stored. He carried notebooks wherever he went, filled with diagrams, sketches, and careful annotations that recorded behaviors no one else could perceive. Even a casual conversation was an experiment. The tone of a guest's laugh, the angle of a head, the placement of hands, all became variables in his ongoing study of human reaction. The patriarch's cruelty was not born of impulsive rage or outward violence. It was methodical, patient, almost scientific, honed over years of observation and calculation. Every decision, every interaction, every ritual in the house was designed to evoke specific responses. He understood that terror need not be loud to be effective, that fear could be cultivated in silence, nurtured through anticipation and refined by repetition. His obsession extended to his family. The twins, barely able to grasp the world, were his primary subjects, yet his attention was not limited to them. Servants, visitors, even his wife were watched for signs of weakness, curiosity, or rebellion. Each person's psyche became a canvas. Their reactions, brushstrokes he could manipulate with subtle gestures, carefully timed sounds, or controlled light. He often spent hours in the nursery alone, observing the twins' breathing, their grasp, the way their tiny heads turned toward or away from stimuli. He did not act immediately but recorded patterns, noting what incited distress, what comforted, what shaped instinct. It was a process of accumulation, layering small manipulations until they became habitual, until responses could be predicted with terrifying certainty. His mind thrived on the invisible architecture of control. Walls, furniture, light, and shadow were instruments in his experiments, each element meticulously adjusted, to produce maximum psychological effect. He developed intricate schedules that divided time into precise units for feeding, sleeping, observation, and controlled play. Even the intervals between attention and neglect were calculated, designed to train resilience, dependence, and fear simultaneously. There was an artistry in his cruelty, a logic that justified every action. If a child flinched, it was data. If a servant hesitated in duty, it was a variable. Every reaction was catalogued in meticulous detail, and each day ended with entries in his journals, his hand moving swiftly to record observations, hypotheses, and minute instructions for the next cycle. The rituals he performed were not superstitious but systematic, yet they carried a symbolic weight that would haunt any who knew their purpose. Candles, shadows, mirrors, and carefully placed objects became instruments to condition and test, to reveal hidden fears, and to mold responses to his precise design. No one could see it, and that was the genius of his approach. To outsiders he remained the calm, intelligent gentleman, incapable of harm, even virtuous in appearance. Yet inside, he was constantly aware of the currents of emotion around him, dissecting, predicting, and controlling with near-perfect precision. He even experimented with himself, testing patience, restraint, and attention to subtle cues, training his own mind to anticipate, manipulate, and dominate. There was a ritual in the way he prepared, the way he arranged objects, the sequences he followed, the measurements he took. Nothing was left to chance. Every hour of the day was a thread in an intricate web of observation and influence. And while the tools of his manipulation were silent, mirrors, lighting, angles, objects, he understood their power to shape perception, to instill subtle dread, to cultivate obedience. His cruelty was invisible to those untrained to perceive it, but it was absolute in its effect. It did not need to shock or kill to be effective. It needed only to be consistent, deliberate, and psychologically unrelenting. He often paused to watch the twins as they slept, noting the micro movements of muscles and eyes, the way one would stir in response to a shadow or a sound. Each observation led to refinement, adjustments in the position of the crib, the orientation of light, the timing of footsteps. Even the act of touching or picking up a child was deliberate, a test of compliance, a reinforcement of control. In his mind, fear was not something to be inflicted recklessly, but cultivated, nurtured, and made precise. It was a tool, a method of understanding, a language of the soul that only he could read and manipulate. The methodical nature of his cruelty meant that no single act was horrific in isolation. It was the accumulation, the invisible shaping of life over time that created horror. Outsiders saw nothing. Smiles, polite conversation, the quiet presence of a man devoted to his family. But within the walls of the manor, the human psyche was dissected daily, shaped with careful hands, conditioned by unseen patterns, and primed for the rituals the Blackwoods would eventually carry out. Even Mrs. Blackwood, though gentle and seemingly warm, followed scripts he designed, her affection a part of the system, a reinforcement of the invisible curriculum of fear and obedience. The precision of his mind was relentless, and it extended beyond observation into preparation. He designed contraptions, subtle and hidden, objects and arrangements that would later serve his purposes, though their immediate use seemed benign. Every step, every choice, every ritual in the house had been rehearsed in his mind countless times before being enacted. The house itself became an extension of his consciousness, a silent laboratory in which he could manipulate time, space, and behavior. By studying and shaping reactions in silence, he ensured that when the time came, the cruelty he had perfected would unfold seamlessly, unnoticed by the world outside. And as he sat at his desk late into the night, pen scratching against paper, diagrams of mirrors, schedules, and human reactions filling page after page, he remained calm, precise, almost serene. The mind that the world trusted had become a machine of observation and control, a hidden engine of darkness, and it would not rest. Its patient, methodical preparation was the foundation of horrors yet to come, horrors that would be almost invisible in execution, yet utterly devastating in effect. The quiet routines of the Blackwood Manor began to take on a sharper, more deliberate edge as the patriarch's designs unfolded in the shadows of every room. Objects that had once seemed ordinary began to reveal their hidden purpose, Chairs were anchored to the floors with small, almost invisible pegs, their edges subtly reshaped so that anyone sitting in them would shift in ways that created unease or tension. Mirrors appeared in unusual corners, reflecting spaces that should have been empty, twisting faces until the observer could no longer recognize themselves, their features bending and stretching in ways that made the mind question memory and identity. Servants who moved through the house noticed nothing at first, and when they did, they chalked it up to odd architecture or imperfect construction. But for the Blackwoods, every item, every device was part of a larger symphony of control. Small cages were constructed, deceptively simple in appearance, yet engineered with the cold precision of a watchmaker. A human form could be placed inside, and over hours the cage would tighten imperceptibly, pressing into joints and muscles in a slow, methodical compression that elicited panic long before pain became physical. The act itself was invisible to those who did not know the mechanisms, a quiet torment that allowed observation of fear without a single mark on the body. Restraints were equally subtle, straps and cords lined with thin filaments that could bend or shift without producing bruising, devices that immobilized with psychological effect, holding the mind prisoner while leaving the flesh almost untouched. The Blackwoods studied these reactions with the same care as any experiment, noting trembling hands, darting eyes, the rise and fall of a chest under quiet panic. Mirrors, too, were instruments of their cruelty. Hung at angles in hallways and stairwells, they reflected distorted images of faces and figures, multiplying shadows and creating spaces where one's own reflection appeared alien. The twins, still too young to understand, were exposed to these arrangements in controlled bursts, their reactions catalogued with meticulous notes on reflexes, eye movements, and even the subtle tightening of tiny fists. Outside observers would have seen only a house of strange decoration. An eccentric family with curious tastes in furniture and mirrors, unaware that every object carried a precise function, a secret choreography intended to teach fear and obedience. It was in this context that one servant disappeared, vanishing into the night without a trace. The household awoke to find only an empty room and a macabre arrangement in its place. Bones, small and unnervingly clean, carefully positioned on the floor to form the letters of his name. A silent, ritualistic signature of the Blackwoods' intent. No one dared question it. The absence was explained away as a sudden flight, but the placement of the bones left a chilling impression, a silent communication of order, control, and inevitability. Within the walls, the air carried a tension that had been building, a sense that the house itself was watching, that the rooms and corridors had been tuned to the rhythms of anticipation and dread. The patriarch moved among the devices with quiet satisfaction, inspecting the subtle mechanisms, adjusting levers, weights, and angles as though tuning an instrument to produce perfect resonance. He was patient, knowing that the instruments of fear required time to reach their full effect. Every object, every tool, every shadow was part of a preparation for events that could not yet be revealed, yet whose inevitability weighed upon the household like a pulse beneath the floorboards. Mrs. Blackwood participated in these preparations with calm precision. Her hands arranged objects, adjusted lighting, and guided the placement of furniture, all under the watchful eye of her husband, executing rituals whose meaning would remain hidden to anyone outside the family. Even the twins were incorporated into these lessons. Playthings were replaced by objects designed to provoke curiosity and unease, dolls with reflective surfaces, small toys that shifted unexpectedly, books with pages that revealed different images depending on the angle of light. Their innocent exploration became observation, their reactions recorded, interpreted, and used to refine the devices and arrangements elsewhere in the house. The patriarch's mind, ever analytical, treated every movement, every pause, every flicker of expression as data. The disappearance of the servant was not a failure, but an extension of his methodology, a prelude, a signal of what the instruments could do in shaping life and perception. He understood that terror needed ceremony, and that ceremony required symbols. Bones arranged to spell a name carried weight beyond physical consequence. They were a message, a reminder of power, a ritualistic punctuation in a life structured entirely by the careful orchestration of fear. The night after the servant vanished, the manor seemed to hum with anticipation. Shadows stretched longer, Corners deepened and the mirrors reflected unfamiliar angles that disoriented even those familiar with the layout. The devices themselves seemed to pulse with latent purpose, poised to influence, confound, and condition. Observing the twins from the nursery doorway, Mr. Blackwood considered how similar principles could be applied to them. Their responses to subtle changes in light, sound, and object placement had already begun to reveal patterns, habits, and fears that could be refined over time. What had begun as gentle manipulation of environment was evolving into a precise, methodical training of their instincts, preparing them for a world the Blackwoods would shape with invisible hands. The servant's fate, though hidden from the public eye, became a template, a demonstration of control and inevitability that informed every adjustment, every ritual, every placement of a mirror or cage. Nothing was left to chance. Even the smallest movements of the twins' limbs or the direction of their gaze were data points in a growing archive of psychological knowledge. Fear, the patriarch knew, could be taught as easily as obedience, and the devices he constructed were the instruments of that education. His mind worked through possibilities endlessly, cataloging outcomes and refining methods, anticipating reactions and testing contingencies. The house, silent and patient, became an extension of his mind, a laboratory for the slow, deliberate cultivation of terror. And as dawn broke over the manor, sunlight catching the edges of mirrors and polished wood, the Blackwoods moved among their devices with calm, precise ritual. The House of Smiles had begun to reveal its shadows, subtle yet inescapable, the architecture of fear meticulously integrated into daily life. Every object, every reflection, every disappearance was part of a choreography only they could see, a prelude to the fate of innocence that awaited in the rooms still untouched by their instruments. Methodical shadows had taken root, invisible yet absolute, and the twins, still unaware, were already part of the design. Beneath the manor, hidden behind a false panel in the cellar, lay a room that no visitor, servant, or neighbor had reason to suspect. Its walls were blackened stone, cold and silent, absorbing every whisper and footstep. Here the Blackwoods' design reached a precision and horror that even the shadows seemed to hesitate before acknowledging. In the center of the room rested two small coffins, each perfectly shaped for the twins, their interiors lined with shards of obsidian, polished until sharp edges glinted like frozen tears. The placement was deliberate, every fragment angled to press lightly into soft skin, a slow intrusion that would teach discomfort, fear, and anticipation in measured doses. The coffins were not meant to kill outright. They were instruments of what the Blackwoods called the purification of fear, a ritual they believed would cultivate obedience and resilience, molding the children's emotional responses with invisible, insidious hands. The twins, still unaware of the designs that awaited them, were drawn to the chamber through play. Each visit began innocently, a new toy, a peculiar box to explore, a game of hide-and-seek conducted under the guise of encouragement. Yet every step into the chamber, every hand reaching toward an object, every small movement of curiosity was a test, a calibration of their reactions. The parents watched from behind carefully angled mirrors, their smiles calm, their gestures affectionate, hiding the intentions that shaped each interaction. Tiny adjustments were made at every visit, the angle of a shard, the firmness of the lids closing, the soft creak of the floorboards, all measured to evoke subtle fear, to teach restraint, to cultivate the lesson that one must obey without question. Light and shadow were manipulated with care. Candles flickered along the walls, their glow casting dancing patterns that obscured corners while highlighting others, training the twins' eyes to track movement and perceive threats that did not exist. Sounds from the rest of the house were muffled or amplified at will, footfalls and whispers, creating an ever-present sense of being watched. The game of play became a lesson in vigilance. The twins learned to internalize terror, to respond to stimuli with the precision their parents required, all while appearing innocent to any casual observer. The room itself seemed alive, imbued with the Blackwoods' intent, every surface and object part of the design. Mirrors reflected not only the twins' images, but the angles of approach, the positioning of limbs, the small flecks of fingers, and the tension in their tiny bodies. Shadows shifted subtly with each flicker of candlelight, and the twins' attention, curiosity, and instinct were measured with scientific patience. Yet there was a ritualistic quality to the chamber that transcended calculation. The placement of each obsidian shard, the angle of each coffin, the patterns of candlelight, and even the cadence of footsteps approaching or receding were choreographed as if the room itself conducted a silent ceremony. The Blackwoods believed in the spiritual efficacy of their design, that fear, purified and internalized, could transform innocence into obedience, shaping not just behavior, but the very essence of the mind. For the twins, the chamber was a place of fascination and mild confusion, a space they did not yet understand but were drawn toward by the gentle coaxing of their parents. Every touch, every exploration, every whispered instruction taught them lessons they could not name. They learned that certain movements triggered discomfort, that silence was rewarded with warmth and attention, that curiosity carried unseen consequences. And in this slow, methodical instruction, their minds began to fold around the patterns imposed upon them, developing instincts attuned to subtle threats and cues, all under the guise of parental affection. The Blackwoods recorded every detail. Notebooks and diagrams catalogued reactions, how long a child's hand trembled before withdrawing, how quickly a gaze shifted to shadows, the tension in a small back or the curling of tiny toes. These observations were analyzed, compared, and used to refine subsequent visits to adjust the coffins, the shards, the lighting, and the games. Every session was part of a continuum, each one building upon the last, each shaping the twins' perception of safety, fear, and control. The cruelty was invisible from the outside. No mark was left to betray the rituals. No scream was allowed to echo beyond the walls. To any visitor, the Blackwoods were loving parents, engaged and attentive, encouraging play and curiosity. The twins smiled, cooed, and reached for their parents with trust, completely unaware of the careful architecture of terror surrounding them. Yet behind the warmth, the chamber worked steadily, embedding lessons of fear and obedience deep within the psyche, shaping instinct and emotional response with unerring precision. The very air in the room seemed to carry anticipation. Each step forward, each tiny movement, each glance at the parents' mirrored reflection reinforced the lesson that their world was measured, observed, and controlled. Even the design of the obsidian shards, glinting coldly beneath the soft candlelight, taught a subtle lesson. Danger can exist without noise, harm without visible injury, fear without immediate consequence. The Blackwoods' brilliance lay in the invisibility of their methods. They created an environment where terror could thrive silently, where obedience could be taught without force, and where the line between affection and manipulation blurred into an inseparable whole. As days turned to weeks, the twins' responses grew more predictable. Their smiles followed subtle cues, their hands froze at signals only the Blackwoods understood, and their curiosity was tempered by instinctual awareness of consequence. Every playful interaction in the chamber was a step in a long, carefully designed journey toward absolute control, the beginning of a ritualized education in terror. And as the candles burned low each night, casting long, flickering shadows over the polished obsidian, the Blackwoods stood at the doorway, calm, devoted, and serene. Their hands rested gently on the twins' shoulders, their eyes full of warmth to any outsider. Yet in their minds, they were architects of fear, artists of control, and conductors of a ritual that transformed innocence into obedience. The whispering chamber, hidden beneath the manor, held the slow, methodical pulse of cruelty, silent to the world, yet shaping the lives of the children in ways that would echo through every step, glance and heartbeat they would take in the years to come. And outside, the house maintained its mask of perfection. Laughter, sunlight, flowers, and smiles, all hiding the rhythm of terror that moved steadily, invisibly below. The Blackwoods selected their first subject with quiet deliberation, a servant whose obedience had been exemplary, but whose curiosity occasionally flickered too brightly. He was summoned under the guise of a routine task, asked to inspect a device in the cellar, unaware that each step had been designed to draw him further into the patriarch's intricate web. The room he entered was dimly lit, shadows pooling in corners, and at its center hung a cage unlike anything the manor's staff had ever seen. It was narrow, suspended from the ceiling by thick iron chains, lined internally with an impossible array of tiny gears, levers, and delicate metal filaments, each positioned with painstaking care to interact with the human body. The moment the servant was guided inside, the door clicked shut behind him, and the mechanisms began their quiet orchestration. Small pins pressed gently against his skin, adjusting subtly with every movement. Levers caught folds of fabric. Tiny gears brushed against flesh in sequences, timed to provoke alarm without leaving visible wounds. The effect was cumulative, a growing, creeping awareness of restriction, of vulnerability and of danger that could not be escaped. Above him, mirrors were positioned to reflect every angle of his body. Every expression of panic multiplied infinitely across the walls so that he could see himself trembling from a dozen perspectives at once. The reflections magnified fear, creating the sensation that the entire room was watching, that his terror had shape and form beyond his own perception. Sounds of his own movements became instruments of his torment. The creak of the cage, the subtle grind of gears, the faint tinkle of chains, each amplified by careful positioning and unseen resonances in the stone walls. There was no immediate pain, no sudden injury, only the slow, relentless intrusion of control into every motion, every thought. His mind began to race, trying to predict the next intrusion, the next pinch, the next mechanical whisper against his skin, yet each calculation failed. The design was too precise, too methodical, a system beyond instinct or imagination. Hours stretched into an eternity. The servant's breathing became shallow, his muscles quivering, his eyes darting from reflection to reflection, searching for escape in patterns that did not exist. The Blackwoods observed from hidden angles, taking notes, adjusting minor levers or weights with imperceptible movements, testing the limits of endurance and psychological collapse. It was not the cage that would ultimately define the experiment, but the mind's unraveling under the certainty of observation. The realization that every movement, every reaction was catalogued, judged, and used to shape future experiences. Slowly, the gears began to shift more aggressively, pinching and scratching in a rhythm calibrated to produce maximum distress. The servant's body grew tense, sweat prickling across his skin, pulse rising, yet outwardly he appeared to move normally, his fear invisible to any untrained eye. The mirrors multiplied each expression of panic, turning fleeting grimaces into an unending gallery of terror. He began to talk to himself, whispering prayers, pleading silently to the unseen observer, begging for the ordeal to end. But the Blackwoods offered only calm smiles and quiet adjustments, their hands guiding the subtle mechanisms with surgical care. Time became distorted. Minutes felt like hours, hours like days. The cage allowed for minimal movement, forcing the servant to twist, flex, and shift in exact accordance with the mechanical demands of the device. His body began to fail, muscles burning with effort, joints aching from the relentless precision of the gears and levers, yet no wound bled, no mark remained. The torture was invisible, the cruelty methodical, and the lesson embedded deep within the psyche. That control could exist without overt violence, that fear could be absolute without being seen. As the experiment continued, his mind fractured further. Each reflection reminded him of helplessness, each noise of movement confirmed captivity, each subtle adjustment reinforced inevitability. He imagined that the walls themselves were closing in, that the room had grown alive with intention, that every mechanism had consciousness and desire. The Blackwoods documented every detail, timing, reaction, posture, and even the micro-expressions that flickered across his face like lightning. These observations would later inform the twins' training, providing a blueprint for the cultivation of fear and obedience in innocence. The culmination of the experiment came not with sudden death, but with slow collapse. The servant's body weakened, exhaustion overtaking resistance. Yet his terror persisted until the final moments, each blink, each shiver, a demonstration of the psychological architecture perfected by the Blackwoods. When the cage finally released him, though in reality release came only in the form of death, the room was silent, untouched, clean, leaving no evidence for the outside world. Only the Blackwoods journals bore witness, a careful record of the methodical cruelty that had been executed in perfect secrecy. The experiment had achieved its goal, terror measured, endurance tested, control absolute. For the twins, it would serve as a blueprint, a lesson in the architecture of fear that would be woven into their earliest experiences. Every mirror, every mechanism, every shadow in the house had been refined through this trial, a rehearsal in shaping the mind and body simultaneously. The patriarch understood that cruelty was most effective when unseen, subtle and inevitable, that terror delivered in silence was more profound than any outburst of violence. The servant's end was both a demonstration and a teaching, an invisible template for the precise cultivation of obedience and fear. The room returned to quiet, the mechanisms at rest, the mirrors reflecting only empty space. Outside, the manor continued its daily rhythms. Laughter in the hall, the scent of baking bread, the sound of birds outside the windows. No one would ever suspect what had occurred beneath their feet. And within the Blackwoods minds, the experiment was already complete, analyzed, catalogued, and ready to be adapted. The twins, still too young to comprehend, were already being conditioned by the subtle echoes of methodical cruelty, their instincts attuned to patterns of observation, reflection, and silent control. The first experiment had succeeded, proving that fear could be taught, measured, and embedded without leaving a mark, and that the mind, when meticulously studied and manipulated, was a more powerful instrument than any tool of flesh or steel. It was a lesson in patience, observation, and absolute control, a template that would define every ritual, every device, and every shadow in the Blackwoods household for the years to come. And as the night settled over the manor, calm and undisturbed, the Blackwoods moved through the halls with serene faces, their hands arranging objects, their eyes scanning for reaction, their minds already plotting the next stage, the next subject, the next extension of their quiet, methodical cruelty. The games the Blackwoods devised for the twins had begun as innocent diversions, simple exercises in attention and curiosity, but over time they evolved into carefully orchestrated rehearsals of fear and obedience. Each plaything in the nursery was transformed into an instrument of subtle torment, an object that taught lessons the children could not yet name. Dolls were lined with hidden needles so fine that a light brush of a finger would produce a sharp, almost imperceptible sting, enough to elicit surprise and hesitation, but leave no mark visible to anyone else. The twins learned quickly to handle the dolls with extreme care, their tiny hands brushing over seams, checking angles, and pausing before each movement, internalizing caution as instinct. Books, once innocent conduits of imagination, were altered in quiet ways. Edges were shaved razor-thin, pages weighted to shift unexpectedly, corners angled to catch skin lightly but painfully. The twins' explorations became exercises in precision. A wrong turn of a page, a careless grasp, produced discomfort that trained both attention and fear. Even chairs were instruments of instruction. Some were constructed to collapse in sequences that maximized surprise and disorientation, tilting, shifting, and giving way in carefully timed patterns. The children learned to anticipate the subtle cues, the micro-creaks, the shifts in shadow, internalizing awareness of cause and effect in ways that went far beyond ordinary play. Every object, every toy, every piece of furniture carried both symbolic and practical weight. The Blackwoods viewed these games not merely as tests of obedience, but as lessons in terror itself. That danger could be present in the familiar, that harm could be invisible, and that anticipation of pain could shape instinct and attention more effectively than punishment alone. Light and sound were manipulated with equal care. Candles were moved slowly across the room, casting shifting shadows that obscured corners or elongated shapes, training the twins' vision to detect subtle changes in the environment. Soft bells or the creak of a floorboard, amplified or dampened at the parents' discretion, taught the children to connect sound with expectation, creating an internal rhythm of caution and alertness. The rituals were cumulative, layering lessons over time. Each session began with what seemed to be ordinary play, stacking blocks, reaching for a toy, turning a page. But every action was observed, recorded, and responded to with minute adjustments in the environment. Say a block might be positioned to topple unexpectedly. A doll rotated to reveal a hidden needle, a chair slightly tilted, teaching anticipation and restraint with each interaction. The twins' reactions were catalogued meticulously, eyes widening, hands freezing, tiny tremors, the instinctive curling of toes. Each became data points in the Blackwoods' growing archive of psychological observation. The children were unaware that these exercises were preparing them for a life in which fear and obedience would become indistinguishable from safety and love. Their trust in their parents remained intact, and yet the games planted the seeds of instinctive caution and submission. The horror of these lessons was inventive as much as it was symbolic. Every object carried a dual purpose: practical control and moral instruction. A needle in a doll taught pain and anticipation. A collapsing chair taught consequence. A razor-edged book taught precision and the fragility of safety. The twins were learning not just to obey, but to anticipate danger, to internalize fear as a natural part of interaction with the world around them. Even the rhythm of the games was ritualistic. Sessions occurred at the same times each day. Shadows and light timed to match the intervals of play, soft sounds introduced at precise moments to condition reaction. The nursery became a stage for controlled chaos, every detail arranged to maximize learning and minimize exposure to obvious harm. And always the Blackwoods observed calm, smiling, serene. Their hands guided the placement of objects, adjusted lighting and corrected posture or movement, each intervention disguised as gentle instruction. From the outside, the family remained the picture of care. Laughter, coos, and affectionate gestures, all performed with a calm precision that hid the calculated terror beneath. The twins, oblivious to the full intent of their education, absorbed every lesson instinctively. Touch became something to approach with caution, movement something to measure, curiosity something to moderate. Their minds folded around the subtle signals, instinct shaping itself to match the architecture of control built for them. Even when one twin reacted suddenly to a hidden needle or a shifted book, the response was recorded and reinforced in a pattern that taught both attention and suppression. The child learned to control instinct, to internalize reaction, and to obey the invisible rules of the house without question. The Blackwoods' philosophy was clear. Fear could be taught gradually, invisibly, and with absolute precision. Pain did not need to be extreme. Anticipation, surprise, and psychological weight were sufficient. And so each day, each session, each ritual became part of the twins' education in terror. It was an education disguised as play, a curriculum of obedience, awareness, and internalized dread that no outsider would recognize. The nursery, bright and cheerful in appearance, held instruments of control so subtle that the children's smiles and laughter concealed the shaping forces at work. The Blackwoods had created a space where innocence and fear coexisted, indistinguishable to anyone looking from the outside. The games were not random nor cruel without reason. They were a methodical architecture of learning, shaping instinct, and preparing the twins for a life defined by the precise, ritualized manipulation of mind and body. And as the sun set outside the manor, casting warm light over the garden and the facade of serenity, the twins played quietly in the nursery, exploring dolls, books, and blocks, unaware that every movement, every touch, every glance at their parents was being recorded, analyzed, and integrated into the next ritual of instruction. The House of Smiles hid a chamber of meticulous terror, and the children's innocence, preserved in their eyes and laughter, was steadily bending to the will of the adults who watched, guiding and shaping it. The lessons of pain, fear, and obedience had begun, silent, invisible, and unrelenting. A ritualistic education in terror that would mark every instinct, every reaction, and every heartbeat of the twins for the years to come. The night arrived with an unnatural calm, the air heavy with anticipation, as though the house itself had paused in reverence. Candles lined the halls, casting flickering shadows that seemed to crawl along the walls, reaching toward the hidden chambers where the final preparations were made. The twins, still trusting, were led into the underground room beneath the manor, a space they had visited before yet never fully understood. Tonight, however, the atmosphere was different. The room had been transformed, walls etched with symbols, lines carved into stone in symmetrical precision, and the air thick with the faint scent of wax, earth, and resin. The coffins, small, oblique, lined with glinting obsidian shards, sat at the center, polished until they reflected the candlelight like black mirrors. Every object, every candle, every line on the floor had a purpose, a function in the ritual that the Blackwoods had perfected over months. The twins were guided carefully, hands held, their small feet stepping over faintly drawn markings that dictated precise positioning. The parents' faces were serene, devoted, masks of love that hid the grim intent behind every gesture. Servants stood at discreet intervals, silent observers, ready to intervene if a movement deviated from the strict choreography. The ceremony began with what the Blackwoods called the invocation of stillness. Soft incantations murmured over the children, words whose meaning was lost to anyone but the family. The twins, too young to comprehend, absorbed the cadence and rhythm, a hypnotic prelude that trained attention and anticipation. The ritual was slow, deliberate. Each step, each placement, each adjustment of a limb, a finger, a shoulder was exact. The parents ensured that the children were positioned perfectly within the coffins, their bodies aligned, so that the obsidian shards would press lightly along specific points of contact, enough to evoke discomfort and terror, without immediate injury. Candles were moved in patterns that created shifting shadows over the twins' faces, teaching recognition of threat through subtle light. Mirrors angled in the corners reflected the image of the coffins endlessly, multiplying the perception of enclosure and observation, so that even within the black interior, the children's eyes saw confinement and anticipation from multiple perspectives. Servants, carefully trained, adjusted hidden mechanisms that allowed the lids to close incrementally, pressing the obsidian against skin with an almost imperceptible weight. The motion was measured in seconds and minutes, each fraction calculated to prolong awareness and amplify instinctive fear. Every brush of the shards, every small movement of the coffin was a lesson in control. The earth that would eventually cover the coffins was not brought hastily but placed in slow increments. The Blackwoods had instructed that soil be poured only gradually, each handful weighted in timing and placement, so that the twins would experience the slow encroachment of confinement, the creeping pressure of darkness and isolation, the gradual suffocation of sensation. Even the outside world, beyond the walls of the hidden chamber, remained unaware. The house hummed with normalcy, the garden glowed softly in moonlight, the servants above carried out their ordinary duties, and yet beneath their feet, terror was unfolding with surgical precision. The ritual extended beyond physical confinement. Symbols etched into the wood and stone carried significance the twins could not perceive, but the repetition of the patterns, the alignment of lines, and the methodical gestures of the parents created a psychological architecture that the children absorbed. The slow lowering of lids, the placement of tiny weights, the measured shift of soil and light all became part of an invisible curriculum, teaching fear, obedience, and anticipation. The Blackwoods watched, calm and serene, observing reactions, noting the smallest flicker of emotion, the twitch of a finger, the rise and fall of a chest. Their hands adjusted subtle angles, repositioned shards, and ensured that every element conformed perfectly to the intended design. To the twins, the experience was incomprehensible yet immediate. The walls closing in, the light dimming, the shadows multiplying, the weight pressing ever so slightly against their skin. Fear was internalized silently, sharpened by ritual and reinforced by parental presence, the most intimate of betrayals masked as love. The servants, though complicit, acted only as extensions of the ritual, their movements choreographed, silent, unobtrusive, maintaining the facade of ordinary duty. Even the instruments themselves were subtle. Levers hidden beneath the floor adjusted pressure, small chambers shifted air to create muffled sounds, and mirrors reflected angles meant to disorient, without alarming the outside observer. Hours stretched into eternity. The twins' small bodies were subjected to prolonged confinement and pressure, a slow suffocation that was ceremonial, methodical, and psychologically devastating. Every second was a lesson, the impossibility of escape, the weight of observation, the inevitability of the environment. Their instincts sharpened, their trust in movement constrained, and their understanding of safety became inseparably bound to the presence and actions of the Blackwoods. The ritual culminated with the final placement of earth over the coffins, poured carefully in measured handfuls until the twins were nearly concealed. Candles flickered, shadows danced, and the mirrored reflections created infinite repetitions of enclosure. In those final moments, the room exuded a still, oppressive silence, broken only by the subtle shift of soil and the measured breath of the children. The Blackwoods' faces remained calm, their hands resting lightly on the coffins, their eyes filled with a calculated devotion, masking the extent of their cruelty. Every gesture, every step, every detail of positioning had been perfected to maximize psychological terror while minimizing external detection. The world outside remained untouched, ignorant as the twins experienced confinement, fear, and anticipation in a ritual that was at once invisible and absolute. And when the ceremony concluded, the chamber returned to silence, the instrument still, the shadows at rest. The Blackwoods recorded every observation in their journals, detailing the responses, movements, and subtle expressions of terror. This documentation would serve as the blueprint for the remaining years of conditioning, ensuring that every subsequent ritual and device refined the lessons of fear, obedience, and anticipation that the twins now carried deeply within their young minds. The night ended with the manor bathed in the soft glow of candlelight, a house of warmth and smiles above, and beneath it, the evidence of a methodical, ceremonial cruelty, invisible to outsiders yet profoundly transformative. The twins, still too young to comprehend, had been marked by experience, their innocence overshadowed by the meticulous architecture of terror their parents had designed. And as the Blackwoods extinguished the candles and left the chamber, calm and composed, the legacy of the night lingered in every shadow, every corner, every silent reflection, a haunting reminder of the precision and devotion with which evil can operate in the guise of love. After the night of ritual and suffocation, the Blackwood Manor resumed the outward rhythm of ordinary life, a seamless performance that masked the depths of calculated terror beneath its walls. Morning light spilled through tall windows, illuminating polished floors and flower-filled halls, and the sounds of domestic activity, footsteps, clattering dishes, the hum of conversation, resumed as though nothing had transpired in the shadows below. Laughter echoed in corridors, where it had once carried only care and warmth. Meals were prepared with the same meticulous attention as always, the aroma of bread, roasted meats, and sweet pastries filling the air. Outsiders who entered the home would have noted nothing amiss. A family attentive to its routines, servants diligently fulfilling their duties, and a patriarch and matriarch, whose smiles and gestures conveyed a serene domesticity. The twins, outwardly unscathed, participated in these routines with the innocence and trust of children, their small hands reaching for utensils, their voices bright and lively, their eyes reflecting no knowledge of the horrors that had just shaped their perception of the world. Yet within the manor, the truth of the night persisted in silence, tangible in its weight yet imperceptible to those not trained to perceive it. Servants moved carefully, whispering to one another in hushed tones, voices threaded with unease as they spoke of echoes in the walls and movements in the shadows. They avoided certain rooms, lingered near doors, and sometimes paused in hallways as if listening to currents no one else could hear. Fear had become an invisible architecture of life, embedded so subtly that it could be felt but never named. The patriarch, for his part, continued the quiet work of documentation with methodical precision. His journals, hidden behind false panels and beneath floorboards, were filled with coded entries, observations of the twins' micro-reactions, notes on the shifting shadows and sounds in each chamber, and precise accounts of the instruments, mechanisms, and ceremonial arrangements he had employed. Every flick of a finger, every tremor of a toe, every glance at a mirror or reflection was recorded, catalogued, and analyzed. The writing itself was ritualistic, symbols, diagrams, and shorthand that only he could decipher, each entry a continuation of the silent experiment of control and terror. These journals were the true record of life in the manor, the hidden ledger of a family whose public persona masked the extent of psychological mastery exercised within private walls. Even as life appeared ordinary, the house itself seemed alive with the memory of ritual. Candles left unlit retained subtle wax patterns. Mirrors reflected angles that reminded the twins of confinement. Furniture remained positioned to elicit instinctive caution. The environment was a silent tutor, reinforcing lessons of vigilance, anticipation, and obedience, a presence felt rather than named. Outsiders, encountering only the surface, saw nothing but stability. Friends and neighbors described the Blackwoods as exceptionally attentive parents, their children well-behaved, their home orderly and inviting. Local authorities and clergy visited, impressed by the apparent harmony, noting nothing unusual, unaware that beneath polished floors and flowered windows lay a complex web of fear, ritual, and surveillance. The horror of the manor's secret was in its invisibility. Evil had no outward expression. It was methodical, deliberate, and normalized within its own walls. It was a system of control so subtle that it evaded scrutiny, moral censure, and legal recognition. Fear and obedience had become habits internalized by the twins, reinforced by ritual, observation, and silent instruments of psychological manipulation. And yet the Blackwoods' methods were invisible to the world outside. Time passed, measured and precise. The twins grew, their behaviors increasingly reflective of the lessons embedded during the whispering chamber and the rituals of innocence. Small habits, the careful placement of hands, the instinctive freezing at subtle cues, the heightened awareness of sound and shadow became second nature, invisible threads woven into the tapestry of daily life. The patriarch continued to refine his instruments and methods, experimenting in quiet adjustments. A mirror shifted slightly. A floorboard creaked at an altered angle. A candle burned longer or shorter to change shadow patterns. These modifications were imperceptible to anyone but the family, yet they reinforced control, precision, and the inescapability of observation. Servants whispered only in private, sharing fragments of intuition that hinted at the unnatural atmosphere, the echoes in the walls, the impossibility of fully relaxing within the manor. They spoke of the absence of screaming, yet the presence of dread, of rooms that seemed to move subtly, and of children whose behavior had acquired a preternatural attentiveness to light, sound, and the minutiae of adult movement. Even the twins, conditioned though they were, sometimes paused in silent recognition of these unspoken rhythms, the imprint of fear subtly embedded in instinct. The Blackwoods' public facade remained impeccable. Meals were served on polished china, rooms maintained in perfect order, guests welcomed with warmth, and the appearance of domestic normalcy preserved with meticulous care. Outsiders never glimpsed the instruments, mechanisms or hidden rituals, never suspected the whispered journals, and never recognized the lessons of terror being internalized by the youngest members of the household. The contrast between public perception and private reality was total. In the manor, fear and ritual were omnipresent. Beyond it, the family appeared ordinary, even exemplary. This duality was the essence of the Blackwoods' genius and horror. Evil invisible, normalized, untouchable by law or morality, operating silently beneath the veneer of domestic perfection. The journals, coded and hidden, ensured that the methodology of terror was never lost, and that the family's experiments could continue indefinitely, refined with each observation, each adjustment, and each day of life passing in outward normalcy. The manor had become both a laboratory and a theater, with the twins as silent participants, servants as instruments, and the Blackwoods as calm, devoted conductors of a system of control so precise it seemed impossible to detect. And within the quiet rooms, beneath polished floors, and behind mirrored reflections, the truth of the house persisted. Evil need not roar to be absolute. It need not leave marks to be effective, and it need not be visible to endure. It thrived in secrecy, in routine, and in the careful orchestration of perception, teaching that terror can be invisible, normalized, and nearly untouchable. The Blackwoods' legacy, as they meticulously recorded in code and concealed in shadow, was a haunting testament to the quiet operation of methodical evil. It demonstrated how cruelty could hide behind warmth, how fear could be cultivated invisibly, and how innocence could be shaped and controlled without the world ever knowing. And as the manor settled into its nightly stillness, the echoes in the walls seemed to breathe with memory, a silent reminder that the house itself had become a vessel for lessons in terror, a place where evil could operate without scrutiny, and where the consequences of unseen cruelty extended far beyond what any outsider could imagine. Decades had passed since the Blackwoods' quiet reign of terror, and yet the house at the edge of the Maryland woods had never truly been forgotten. Stories lingered in whispered tones among the descendants of neighbors, rumors of a family whose perfection hid a darkness too precise to be imagined. When the manor was finally opened for renovation, the discovery of the patriarch's meticulously hidden diaries sent shockwaves through the town, the county, and eventually the nation. Bound in worn leather and locked behind false panels, the journals revealed a level of calculation that defied comprehension. Pages upon pages catalogued the twins' earliest reactions to light, sound, and touch. Instruments of terror were described in diagrams, with mechanisms and devices explained in surgical detail, cages that compressed over hours, mirrors that distorted reflections, toys designed to inflict imperceptible harm, all employed in an invisible curriculum of obedience and fear. The diaries chronicled not just cruelty, but a philosophy of control. The patriarch had written as if documenting a scientific experiment, each entry reflecting obsession, patience, and a total absence of empathy. Words were coded, symbols drawn, to mask intent from the untrained eye, yet the meaning could not be hidden from those who studied them carefully. Society recoiled in horror. Headlines screamed of unimaginable cruelty cloaked in domestic normalcy. The country was forced to confront the reality that evil could operate quietly under the guise of parental love and persist unobserved for years. Legal scholars debated, journalists analyzed, and lawmakers convened. Within months, child protection laws were rewritten, creating stricter regulations for household oversight, mandatory reporting of unusual practices, and formal accountability for the manipulation and psychological harm of minors. The Blackwoods manor became a relic of warning, its walls preserved as much as possible, the hidden chambers sealed for posterity. Visitors were allowed only under strict supervision, the house now functioning as both museum and cautionary tale. The twins' fate, though long hidden, became a symbol of what could happen when innocence met methodical cruelty. Their lives, shaped by ritual, observation, and silent terror, became the ultimate demonstration of how easily the human mind could be molded in secrecy. Scholars of psychology and criminology studied the journals as though examining the mind of a long-dead predator. They noted the meticulous recording of reactions, the layering of anticipation and discomfort, and the seamless integration of fear into daily life. The Blackwoods techniques were horrifying in their precision, illustrating that the greatest evil often leaves no physical trace and operates quietly, undetected, within the bounds of ordinary life. Philosophers reflected on the nature of such cruelty, emphasizing that evil thrives not only in overt violence, but in the invisible, the normalized, and the socially accepted. The Blackwoods methods had relied on routine, affection, and the illusion of normalcy to manipulate the most vulnerable. In every measured glance, every calculated adjustment of environment, and every ritualized action, the patriarch had demonstrated that fear could be internalized as instinct, obedience could be cultivated silently, and innocence could be shaped into submission without external scrutiny. The moral weight of these reflections extended beyond the manor. Communities grappled with the notion that evil could exist without spectacle, hidden in the mundane, and that the structures of everyday life could be exploited to devastating effect. The psychological lessons were stark. Humans are vulnerable not only to physical violence, but to meticulously orchestrated control, especially when perpetrated by those trusted most. The Blackwoods legacy also illuminated the capacity for meticulous planning to transcend generations, affecting not only direct victims, but the culture around them. Families, neighbors, and society at large were forever marked by the realization that ordinary appearances could conceal absolute cruelty. Educational programs incorporated the case into discussions of child protection, ethics, and psychological manipulation, emphasizing the importance of vigilance, transparency, and skepticism of appearances. Exhibits at the manor displayed facsimiles of devices, diagrams from the journals, and explanations of the subtle ritualistic lessons taught to the twins. Visitors often left in silence, haunted by the precision of cruelty and the realization that it could operate invisibly, in silence and under the guise of care. Historians contextualized the Blackwoods within a wider tradition of hidden methodical cruelty, noting that their case was extreme yet illustrative of a broader human vulnerability. The ability of the mind to rationalize affection while harboring intent to dominate, manipulate, and harm. Scholars debated the intersection of intellect and cruelty, acknowledging that the patriarch's charm and public persona had been integral to sustaining his methods for so long. In retrospect, the twins' survival, to the extent it existed, was seen not as resilience alone, but as a consequence of the exactness with which fear had been taught, internalized, and normalized. The psychological imprint, though invisible to the casual observer, was permanent, a reminder that cruelty could be encoded into the very instinctual fabric of a child's behavior. Memorials were erected in nearby towns, honoring the need to protect innocence and commemorate the victims, though names were often lost to secrecy and time. The story of the Blackwoods became a cautionary narrative, a lesson in the hidden operation of evil, the fragility of innocence, and the insidious power of methodical cruelty. The manor itself, standing silent and imposing, symbolized both warning and historical curiosity. Its preserved halls, secret chambers, and archived journals reminded every visitor that appearances can deceive, that evil can be deliberate, patient, and invisible, and that society's structures are only as protective as the vigilance of those who enforce them. Reflecting philosophically, the story of the Blackwoods suggested that evil rarely announces itself in grandeur. It grows quietly, thrives in normalcy, and often hides behind love, kindness, and ordinary routines. It manipulates perception, weaponizes affection, and teaches obedience to terror in ways that evade scrutiny. The most devastating cruelty may not be explosive, visible, or sensational. It can exist in silence, in repetition, in the careful orchestration of anticipation, and in the shaping of innocence into submission. The Blackwoods demonstrated that methodical, unseen cruelty leaves a legacy not only of trauma, but of permanent cultural awareness. Lessons drawn from the diaries informed legal, educational, and psychological practices for generations. They underscored the necessity of questioning appearances, monitoring for subtle signs of manipulation, and recognizing that children, the most trusting and observant members of society, are uniquely vulnerable to invisible instruction in fear. For the public, the shock was accompanied by a grim fascination. Media coverage relived the details of ritual, device, and observation, highlighting the horrifying ingenuity of the Blackwoods' designs. Each revelation compounded the emotional weight, the invisibility of their methods, the care taken to conceal terror, and the insidious embedding of lessons in fear. The story forced a confrontation with the uncomfortable truth that society's ordinary routines, social trust, and assumptions about parental care can be exploited with devastating precision. Ultimately, the Blackwoods' legacy was defined not just by the horror they enacted, but by the permanence of its lessons. Laws were strengthened, social awareness heightened, and educational programs developed, all in response to cruelty so meticulously hidden it might otherwise have gone unrecorded. The world had been scarred, not only by what had happened within the walls of the manor, but by the realization that similar patterns could unfold elsewhere if vigilance faltered. The manor remained silent and imposing, a testament to the precision of evil, a caution to generations who would follow. Visitors left with lingering unease, haunted by the understanding that meticulous cruelty, masked as love and normalcy, could exist anywhere. The journals remained, codified but accessible to scholars, their lessons permanent, their testimony chilling in clarity, and as the narration draws to its conclusion, the final reflection settles over every detail, every ritual, every lesson. Imparted in silence, evil often hides in normalcy, thrives in patience, and manipulates innocence with subtlety so precise it is nearly undetectable. Its consequences ripple far beyond those immediately involved, shaping society, law, and the understanding of human psychology for generations. The story of the Blackwoods is a warning, a haunting reminder, and a moral reflection. The world may appear ordinary, but even in the most benign spaces, the architecture of cruelty can exist, invisible, methodical, and devastating. And now, as we leave the halls of the manor and close the journals, one question remains, lingering in the mind and heart of every observer. What do you think? Could this happen again?